Hi, Constance.
What's your view? What's that picture of?
This picture is Helsinki University, the Viki campus, where we
Super. That's great.
have a
Thank
forest department. So the blue building is called Blue Building, but it's the library.
Oh, the library at the University of Helsinki. Wonderful. Helsinki University. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think that we shall just allow other people coming in to join us just a couple of minutes late. I'm delighted to see everyone. Let me just share my screen and we shall get started. All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to this roundtable discussion on rural aspirations, where we're taking a view of livelihood decisions and rural development trajectories. We're very delighted to have you join us for this launch of the special issue of the European Journal of Research and Development. My name is Constance Neely. I am with the Shared Decision Hub with C4ICRAF. And today, we're going to be highlighting some of the papers, some of the synthetic information that has emerged from the special issue. There are a breadth of contributions, but today there's going to be an emphasis on the methods for measuring and eliciting aspirations, demonstrating how research practice and policy actors have applied or could apply these approaches to inform and facilitate future development initiatives. If you haven't had a chance to read the papers in the special issue, we hope that today will incentivize you to delve into the papers. But we're going to spend a lot of time today hearing from you as well. So today we want to celebrate the work, and more importantly, we want to interrogate, we want to exchange ideas, we want to challenge assumptions, and we want to add value to the insights that have emerged from the papers. So just getting started, what I would appreciate is if I could invite everyone to type into the chat box and tell us your name and your affiliation. And please add if you are an author, because of course we can't have all of the authors present, but we definitely want to recognize authors that have been a part of the special issue. So in the chat box, can I invite people, name, affiliation, and whether you are an author, co-author. Thank you so much. So just a bit about today, the flow of our event. We're going to invite our colleague who is one of the editors to give us an overview of the framework of the special issue. Then we're going to invite two presentations that are focused on the difference between aspiration and ambition. Following that, we have an open discussion around what does this mean for future research, and we use research as research in development. Then we'll have two more presentations about divergent views on aspirations, come back for another discussion, and then we'll have a wrap up and close by our editors. I do just want to register that throughout today, please register comments, questions in the chat box as we go. And also please raise your hand. We want to hear from people. So those are ways to rapidly interact. And with that, I'd like to introduce Kai. So Kai House, who's one of the editors, has been working for 15 years on rural development questions from the agricultural as well as the non-agricultural perspective. And across Asia and Africa, he has been exploring ways to improve the demand orientation of support mechanisms, among other options, through the understanding of people's aspirations. And with that, I'm delighted to turn the attention to Kai, and you're going to have to just let me know when to shift screens. Thank you, Kai. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks, Constance. Can you hear me? Does it work now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry for the slight hiccup. I don't know what our internet made a slight mess. So I just want to give a brief introduction of the overall special issue before we move on to the content discussion. Next. So in the special issue, we talk about, Constance, can you move on? Oh, thanks, sorry, that took a while here. In the special issue, all contributions focus on aspirations in several shapes or forms. But the common definition or the umbrella definition is aspirations as desired futures in many shapes and forms. These desired futures are influenced by all sorts of things in your lives, be it just your personal preferences. Then there is social factors that moderate what you desire to do in your future. Institutional influences, constraints, or facilitation mechanisms, power imbalances, or other social influences again. And that all forms sort of the imaginable future that influences the desired future among those. Next. And then there are two sides to the story where people have their own desired future, which would be something like, we used 10 years time as an example timeline, which is not too short, but not too long either. But then there is also more general development aspirations, which one of those would be the SDGs for 2030, that are usually set by political bodies or development organizations like the UN. And in between the two, we have the individuals within these organizations that also have their own aspirations for their work and for their career in general. Thanks. No, 1-4. So within the special issue, we have these two sort of bottom-up and top-down views on aspirations in general that interact amongst each other. Next. And at times these two different sets of aspirations can cause tensions and conflicts where the top-down development goals do not always play out at the local level in a way that corresponds to the people's aspirations that are set in the local communities. And they can actually cause conflicts where they are not aligned properly. Next. So there is a much bigger need to discuss these issues more openly and negotiate between the global agendas and the local aspirations of the people that are affected by development programs and development goals. Next. And within the special issue, we actually have almost all these aspects of aspirations represented with the global development goals as they are set and implemented on the ground, but also the local views and how they see and interact with development progress, development programs or projects. And a few or two of those contributions dealing with how to interact, how to link and align these two streams of aspirations and be more cognizant of the respective other side. And that was just a short background on the overall picture. And now we'll go into these two streams for a more detailed discussion.
Thank you so much, Kai. And so thank you for setting the framework out. I'm still inviting people, if they will, to please put their name and affiliation, and if they're an author, co-author, in the chat box. It'd be lovely to know. All right, we're getting ready to now hear from Dave Harris and Martin Paul Tab Ojong. And let me just introduce these two speakers, and then I will turn it over to them for their first interventions. So Dave Harris has 35 years of agriculture research experience in less developed countries, including long-term assignments in Asia and Africa, the Caribbean. And he is an honorary fellow at ICRSAT, an honorary lecturer at Bangor University, and his research focuses on understanding why rural households adopt or don't adopt or disadopt improved technologies. And along with Dave, we have Martin Paul Tab Ojong. And Martin is, this is a real celebration, a final week PhD candidate in agricultural economics at the Institute for Food and Resource Economics at the University of Bonn. He does research on aspirations, non-cognitive skills, and how they relate to rural poverty and behavioral poverty traps in developing nations. So with that, I will stop sharing the screen and invite Dave or Martin to take the floor, whichever one of you wants to speak first.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Right, fine. Hello, everyone. This is there is some confusion, I think, in the literature about what people mean by aspirations and by ambitions. So we thought we'd better have a quick session to try and discuss this and start some debate. Is there actually a difference, and does it really matter? We looked it up in the dictionary. An aspiration is something that one hopes to accomplish. Has various synonyms, one of which is ambition. So we looked up ambition, and the definition comes out as an eager desire for personal advancement. Has many associated words, some positives, some negatives, and some opposites. And to me, it seems as though rather than these being associated with an end, they're associated with personality traits. So again, for me, to try and give two definitions of aspirations and ambitions, for me, an aspiration includes both an end and a pathway to that end. Is it quantitative? In most cases, no. Is it grounded in reality? An open question at the moment. In contrast, for me, an ambition stresses the desired end with little or no emphasis on how to get to that end. Is it quantitative? Yes, certainly in the way that Martin in the next presentation will describe how it's measured. Again, is it grounded in realism? Again, let's discuss that. For our work in Kenya, which led to the 5 papers from our group in this special issue, we did have an agenda. We're interested in agricultural development, often through agricultural intensification. And the problem we were hoping to address was that adoption of the improved farming technologies that we've been developing for 40 or 50 years has been far less than we expected, far less than we'd planned, and certainly far less than we'd hoped to make an impact. We hope to identify the barriers to adoption of those technologies and come up with possible ways to overcome them. But we were aware that one barrier might be that adopting new ways of farming wasn't actually a high priority for some rural households, which is not something that we as technology developers and promoters often consider. We used an approach involving a tool called SenseMaker, and details of which you can see, you can chase that paper at the bottom of the page. Briefly, respondents tell us a story in relation to a prompt question or a statement. They then interpret their own stories in relation to various signifiers of interest. With additional data, we can apply various qualitative and quantitative analyses. One particular issue we had was that we were conscious of the existence of a project effect. In our experience,
Toure? Sorry, Dave. Toure? Toure? Thank you.
we were conscious of a project effect in which it's quite common for respondents to game the system when interviewed. This is a perfectly natural human reaction. If you turn up in a village with Wheat Research Institute painted on the side, it's amazing how many of your responses are related to wheat, because people know what you're interested in. To try and overcome this, we didn't mention that we had any agricultural affiliations, only a general interest in rural development. And we used a neutral, open prompt, which we hoped was free of any bias. The prompt was, imagine your life in 10 years' time. Please tell a story about how you got to that point from this present day. And I should note that at no time were the words aspiration or ambition or any translations of them used. And we're fairly confident that we were actually getting aspirations as we define them. We found a wide range of diverse aspirations, and for more details, see the 5 papers in the special issue. But the aspirations were across both the farm and the non-farm sectors. Here's a random sample of the narratives that we collected. As you read through them, I think, like me, you will see a pattern in the responses developing, with a focus on the idea that farming for smallholder rural households is not a 100% occupation, and they either choose to or are forced to pursue multiple income strategies. Finally, I want to leave you with this plea for good ideas, which I think is the focus for me for this entire exercise. We have better knowledge of aspirations in various circumstances. What we do not know how to do is to use that knowledge of aspirations to accelerate rural development. And I hope that this session today can move that forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. And I will put that is great. We really appreciate you registering this, and then we're going to go right in to see Martin. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Constance, and thank you very much, Dave, for already bringing us into aspirations. It's getting exciting that we're already getting to talk about aspirations. And yeah, I'll just build up on what Dave was saying, but get a little more into quantitative measures of aspirations. So basically, like Dave highlighted, we should be thinking of aspirations as preferences. So basically, these are goals to which individuals invest time, money, and effort for their attainment. And key thing about aspirations is that they're future-oriented, and honestly, they exclude present-level gratification. So I give a simple example. So you may be hungry now, and you just rush and grab a pizza, that will not pass for an aspiration. But the desire for you to be food secure in the future, accompanied by necessary investments, will definitely pass for an aspiration. And this brings to another nuance about aspirations, that aspirations are indeed not expectations, or aspirations are not ambitions, or because while aspirations are kind of very idealistic and involve a broad range, expectations are more realistic. So it's kind of a dichotomy of possibility versus probabilities. So expectations also internalize a lot of constraints around the individuals looking at the opportunity space, but aspirations do not actually internalize these constraints. And for economists, they'll just say then if aspirations do not internalize constraints, then they need not be rational. So when it comes to the measurement of aspirations, a lot of measures have been used to actually get on aspirations, be it quantitative, be it qualitative. I'm just going to run through this briefly. So when it comes to quantitative measures of aspirations, this is basically gotten through household surveys. And different frameworks have been used. So in one study, which it's key in the special issue, they use this framework from Bernard and Same Professor, where the kind of measured aspirations using a reliable and well-tested scheme based on many questions. I'll talk about that in the slides ahead. But also, as another paper which was not published in the special issue, one could also just get aspirations by using vignettes, so kind of real-time experiments, kind of getting away from a lot of reality, but also being very hypothetical. In a way, this is also very similar to more or less the sense maker tool. But when we talk about qualitative measures of aspirations, like they've already said, which we're not going to, it's this new tool they use to capture aspirations, it's narrative based to making households or individuals to imagine the futures. So kind of you imagine your future and you give a story about them, then from them, a lot of underlying themes have been brought, a lot of key themes are brought out from the stories, and households are then asked, or individuals are then asked to talk about these underlying themes. And when with regards to the quantitative measure, the key thing in the literature when it comes to economics and moving forward in the social sciences, this is validated measurement instrument by Bernard and Same Professor in Ethiopia, where basically they got aspirations by asking 4 main questions. So kind of a major and a minor comment, a maximum and a minimum question. So first of all, set households in a realistic range. So in a way to anchor the household. And I'll talk again about this in the next slide, because in a way that is also a good strategy of making households not to over-report the aspirations, but kind of setting them in a realistic frame. And when these households have been anchored, then they go ahead to now ask, with respect to many dimensions. So one key thing with quantitative aspirations is that we only need to tackle aspirations which can measure. So key dimensions here could include income, could include assets, education, social status, also livestock assets, which is very important in the context of many rural communities in Africa and Asia. And with respect to these 4 or 5 dimensions, what is your level that you have at present? And what level do you like to achieve in your life? So the first question is just the current status, why the next question is the aspirations. And for those already deep into aspiration research, what we're now talking about future-oriented investments and how this relates to aspiration, it's basically the gap between what you aspire for and where you are at the present that kind of begs you to invest in the present, looking already in the future. And with all these dimensions, to kind of have a unique dimension, getting an overall flair of an aspiration to a better life, we kind of advise that you could basically just merge all of these into an index so that you kind of get a feel of what a household or an individual aspires to more broadly. But this also has its limitations, right? Because there are many more things a household or an individual can aspire to, not just income, not just assets. A household could also aspire for food security, for security. And since these are quantitative measures, these are hardly taken into consideration. So this is also kind of a pitfall of the aspirational index. And one key thing with measuring aspirations is the fact that aspirations are purely attitudinal. So unlike outcomes like income or wealth that you can actually observe, or yields when you go to a pharmacy, you cannot observe aspirations. So with this, it's key that you use well-trained enumerators who kind of understand the nuances and kind of understand the differences between aspirations, between hopes, between expectations, and all these other various measures. And already when it comes to the measurement of aspirations, some key potential issues basically just arise from the way aspirations are being defined. So people define aspirations as what you want to achieve in your life, kind of as a goal, as a preference, while some people look at aspirations as basically just a want. So depending on some context, like especially in some Asian contexts, here is Myanmar, where many of households in a particular region are Buddhist. Asking households, what do you want to achieve, would make them feel that they're wealth hungry or they're income hungry. And this basically appears really, really un-Buddhist. So in such a community, researchers are very keen to make sure that they're asking about what is the minimum income or so do you need, or do you feel to feel financially secure other than what you achieve. But at the end, all of these are taken as aspirations. So this is basically a potential issue when it comes to comparability across studies, because everybody talks about aspirations, but everybody measures aspirations differently. Also, different questions, different formulations are used to capture aspirations, especially when it comes to context. So the context in many African regions may be different from the context in Asian regions, and these are also not well taken into account by researchers. And like I said, with this theme of anchoring and social visibility, which is just a normal thing in research, households may just be reporting what you want to hear. And that kind of causes a problem, because like I said, you do not observe aspirations. It's pretty attitudinal. And all of these, if we are not careful, could lead to very biased results and policy implications. So moving forward, it is important that we researchers, policymakers, developmental actors, but especially researchers, should be keen on how they define and measure aspirations. And in the papers, in their work, in the policy reports, it should be clear exactly what they are measuring. So that also influences the task of policymakers. But also moving ahead, it's going to be interesting to see a lot of quantitative and qualitative analysis coming together, putting together tools like SenseMaker, but also the quantitative measures of aspirations, and seeing how that works together. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Martin. All right, let's open the floor. So we have heard the difference between ambitions and aspirations. We've heard about people's reticence to adopting different practices. And now we've heard a little more in detail about the methodologies for measuring these aspirations and some of the aspects that can play against us. So right now I'd like to open the floor, and before we start delving into other questions, I'd like to have Peter, would you be willing to take the floor and add your comment that you've put in the chat box? Thank you, Peter.
Thank you for the presentations, very interesting. And I agree that it's an issue that sometimes we think we know implicitly what the aspirations are of the people we're working with. However, my concern is that often when we talk about rural development, we don't work with every individual, man and woman. We don't work with every individual household. We often work through community structures, community leadership of communities. And one of the major problems that I've seen is the tendency, especially in agriculture, to homogenize recommendations or programs without differentiating between, well, first of all, men and women, which is a big problem.
Hi, Lydia. Hi, I'm on a call.
Sorry, Peter.
Yeah,
Susan Onyango, could you mute, please? Thank you. Please go ahead, Peter.
So there's a lot of differentiation between better off households and poor household, resource poor households. And I'm just wondering if this is to help us to better design rural interventions, or especially agricultural interventions, whether it be evergreening or agroecology, how this research can be relevant. That's my question. Constance, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Peter. So I want to scan the audience and see if there are other contributions or responses to Peter. All right. Well, Peter's made a very, very valuable point about the relevance. I would just say, Martin, would you want to give a short response to what Peter has raised?
Yeah, sure. I can get a go at that. Yeah, I think that is really an interesting comment, and yeah, this is actually at the key of what forms aspirations. So when we're talking about how aspirations are formed from an opportunity space, and in a rural community, that is what forms the aspirations of individuals. So I believe if we are capturing effectively the aspirations of individuals, in a way, it reflects the aspirations of the community. Just 2 years ago, there was a study also looking about community aspirations in rural Pakistan. And this basically just confirms the thought that aspirations are a social construct. So kind of they are formed by the way households see what their neighbors are doing, especially when we're talking about aspirations like education. I want to send my daughter to school if I see my neighbor sending the daughter to school. And in a way, if everybody in the community is acting in the framework of the societal way, looking at social norms, then this is actually just addressing most of the work you're doing. I mean, the key thing about aspirations and where it comes from, it's from Apadurai, and he basically stated that aspirations are really cultural. So we cannot talk about aspirations and we don't give a cultural aspect of it. And if we're talking about how community relates to individuals that we most of the times are working with, or with the communities when we are not working with individuals, in a way, these are all just very related concepts when we're talking about aspirations.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Martin. I'm going to come to Dave, but in the meantime, I'd like to ask our participants to think about what have been your experiences. So many of you have worked in community, on the ground, to make things happen. What has been your experience with working with aspirations, with soliciting aspirations, or the methods that you might have used? And is it appropriate? Please, Dave, go ahead.
Thank you. I'd just like to clarify that when I said that aspirations as measured through narratives wasn't quantitative, I meant each individual aspiration as expressed in a narrative is generally not quantified. However, with a sample of hundreds, however many households, the results and the data are quantifiable to reflect some form of community response. It still leaves us with the problem that it's a statistical construct. 70% of households want X, whereas 20% want Y, which just gives us another whole set of problems. But the ability to quantify the responses at the community level, it is possible.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Dave. All right, Ed, I would love to invite you to take the floor. I'm familiar with your experience, so please, Ed, jump in.
I'm just going to ask a simple question. Whose voice counts at the community level, and whose voice really counts? Because we still, unfortunately, we tend to be dominated by this ubiquitous term, the community, without fully appreciating the different aspirations, the different ambitions of different stakeholders within a community, be it gender, be it elders, be it politicians, be it teachers, be it whoever. So how do we know whose voice counts? Thank you, Constance.
Great question, Ed. And I would actually like to open that up to other participants. What is your experience with this term community, knowing the heterogeneity? How do you deal with this? Whose voice counts? When we talk about even a community vision, how do we come together and feel confident in that? Oh gosh, there are too many amazing people on this call not to get some other responses. I'm available for those. And I'm very patient because we don't just want to hear from the speakers. Mawa, please come give us your views.
Yeah. Hi, Constance. What I want to add to the discussion, to know the community before any intervention. And getting to know the community is really trying to do an in-depth work on what are the different type of actors, the different type of considerations that are important and that are enforced in that community. For example, if you don't know about ethnicity and plan to reach out to migrant, for example, during your intervention,
Mawa, we're having a
you
bit
will
of
not get
trouble
them
hearing you.
because
Okay.
we'll try to capture. Do you hear me now?
Yes, thank you, Mawa.
Do you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
I mean, you have to know the community and you have to know the place before any intervention. And if you don't plan that, you will not get to everybody. So that's my point. Getting to know the place, getting to know the people before any intervention. Usually it's those that are at a place of power that try to capture everything. And people in some places like migrants or like some other type of women or pastoralists, they cannot get involved into interventions because they haven't been planned to be there from the beginning. So that's what I wanted to add. Thank you, Constance.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mawa, for really helping. It is about, and I think that's where this method may be very valuable in terms of the sense maker, making sense of, but if you're not knowledgeable, you are going to miss. So Emmanuel, please, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I think I just want to reiterate on a couple of things that maybe what Martin talked about. The question was also, I mean, how do you know? I think whose thought counts. I think you ask them and they tell you. I think Robert Chambers always says, go and ask them. My experience was quite interesting when I was doing fieldwork in Namibia. We did fieldwork in Namibia, Tanzania, and Kenya, and a couple of works in the special issue have reflected on some of these areas. And coming from East Africa, where we value houses and land, and then going to Namibia, where I could see that people don't value houses. And so when we're asking about asset aspirations, I thought about, do I change our questionnaire to remove this section, because we had one questionnaire that was trying to do cross-country comparison, and I realized actually some of these things really don't apply in some areas because of the cultural concept of what is it? So in Kenya or Uganda or Tanzania, maybe Kenya and Uganda, you have more freehold land, and so individuals aspire to have to own land. In Southern Africa, you have communal land, and everyone has access to this land. So no one has an aspiration on owning 10 acres of land because you can't own it anyway. But people have aspirations of cultural, you could say, capital. You know, whether are they friends the chief, are they friends the Induna, or something like that. But when you're in Kenya and you ask who is the chief of this area, no one knows, because no one has anything of this kind of concept. So I think it's really important to be open-minded in this kind of research, in this kind of work, and not have things that we feel can apply across the slate, because they are very diverse and heterogeneities in everything, in each community. And that's what I found in my work. And there's the additional work that Martin and my colleague Bizrat and others are working on to try and do these cross-country comparisons, which is in working paper format, and hopefully we'll see what comes out of that. But we find these very wide differences that we can't just combine into one narrow view of something.
Super. Thank you so much, Emmanuel, and thank you for reflecting on your own work. So we've had a quick discussion around the, oh gosh, I see another person has added to the mix. So may I quickly invite Christine, if you want to make an intervention?
It's less of an intervention and more of a question. Just in terms of the methodologies that are being discussed, you know, what is the experience that folks have in terms of the applicability of the different methodologies in the design stage? So, you know, even issues that include like participant selection for agricultural interventions, as well as, you know, the monitoring and evaluation stage in terms of understanding outcomes and impacts. And then a second question would be more about, has there been consideration in terms of these methodologies of different reasons for intervention? So for instance, the difference between longer term development kinds of interventions versus shorter term emergency or humanitarian interventions.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Christine. And Detlef, may I give you the floor?
Yeah, thank you. I hope you understand me. I'm sitting in a very noisy street in Berlin. So I wanted to make a comment from the side of the contributors to the special issue who are members of the Collaborative Research Center at the University of Bonn and Cologne. The background of our studies is on the question how futures are made with the empirical background of rural Africa. And one comment from this perspective I would make on the contributions to the special issue is that aspirations are one of the drivers of future making, but only one among others. And I think that's an important question that we keep in mind. What are these other activities or practices that are also contributing to the making of futures? The second comment I would have in the same direction is that aspiration, where you made this distinction in the interventions of two of the speakers, Dave and Martin, in the beginning, that aspiration should be separated from expectation and from ambition. But what we are doing in our research is that we're also making a distinction between aspiration and vision. Vision as a collective driver of development. And I think that's also something very important to keep in mind. The third point I would make is vision may be completely wrong and misleading, but still it is effective in the way how it contributes to future making. And here I would refer to the works of Jens Beckert at the Research Center in Cologne, who's had this his works on what he calls fictional expectations. Fictional expectations are collective beliefs, shared beliefs in a community or a society on how the future will be, regardless of whether this is realistic or not. But these fictional expectations do also become extremely important in shaping futures. The big question for us in our Collaborative Research Center is to what extent all this holds true to the background of rural Africa. So these were just three comments from the perspective of the researchers in the CRC Future Rural Africa. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Detlef. That was a great intervention. And what I'd like to do now, we have, I'd like to take just a couple of minutes and ask Martin and Dave if they want to make a very brief response to some of the things that have been posed. And then we're going to bring in two more speakers, a little bit more into the mix. These two sessions that we have put forward are not exclusive. So I think we're going to trip over into some additional conversation that's similar to what we're having now. Martin, I'll give you the floor first.
I think Dave should speak first. because he has
Okay, Dave, you're on. Perfect.
Okay. There has always been, I mean, and I'm talking from the sort of agricultural development background here. There's always been this problem about individual recommendations for individual households and individual circumstances versus blanket recommendations for everyone in a you know, an agroecological area or a geographical area, and it often comes down to cost. A general recommendation is very cheap to do, but isn't very effective for many or even most of the households, whereas individual recommendations, hopefully, if we do our job right, will be very, very useful for each and every household, but ridiculously expensive. It's a trade-off, as in most things, and this is why I made that plea at the end of my presentation, because one approach with aspirations is to develop typologies of aspirations, analogous to typologies of farm types or what have you. If that's the way to go, then someone somewhere has to make a decision about how broad those typologies are. You know, the ultimate typology is an individual household, and there are millions of them. This is the issue. Although our slightly increased understanding of aspirations is a good thing, I'm really at quite a loss as to how to use them to drive development forward. And that for me is the fundamental issue.
Thank you for that, Dave. Martin, please, any other comments? I really appreciated that comment about how to use it at the design stage. That was quite interesting.
Yes, aspirations are indeed very important, and it's very interesting for policy, but indeed they are no panacea. Yeah, so it's really important to really guide against a narrow focus on aspirations, because also in the literature you see that when aspirations are driven too high, then they could also lead to a lot of frustration. They could also lead to aspiration failures. You hear of large plans and also large failures. And this is also very key in low and middle income countries where inequality is high, and you get households get very high aspirations, then they get frustrated, and this may lead in many times to a lot of conflicts as well. So it's important that we really guide against no narrow focus on aspirations.
Excellent. Thank you for that. All right, let's get some more thinking into the mix. I'm just going to share my slide for 1 minute as I introduce our next colleagues. So right now, we're going to hear from Mary Crossland and from Javier Rabia Diaz. Mary is a PhD candidate at Bangor University, working in collaboration with the World Agroforestry in Kenya. Her research centers on the social dimensions of land restoration, with specific focus on the role of intra-household gender relations and the uptake and use of agricultural innovations. Javier holds a chair in human geography at the Institute of Geography and is associated with the Global South Study Center at the University of Cologne. He has research interests in the regional outcomes of participating in global production networks, regional impacts of transformation processes induced by political and structural change, and the impacts of natural risks on people, firms, and regions. He also participates in the Future Rural Africa, Future Making and Socio-Ecological Transformation, and concentrates on desired and undesirable regional socioeconomic effects of 2 growth corridors in Namibia and Tanzania. So with that, Mary, I believe you're going to speak first.
Yes, yeah, that'd be great. Okay, hopefully you can all see my slide.
Ken, good,
Great.
thanks, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, really what I'm going to be talking about is going to be building on some of the discussion that we're already starting to have. And so I guess one of the main expectations around taking a bottom-up view is that understanding people's current situations and their desired trajectories, and also those influences that shape those aspirations, can be used to align support mechanisms with people's wants and needs. And that development actions that do are going to have a greater chance of being successful. And so across the studies in the special issue that take this kind of local level perspective, there's several key kind of insights that emerge in relation to this, and how considering local aspirations might change or even challenge some of our assumptions around rural development. And so one clear message, as we've already kind of seen, is that people's perceived opportunity space plays a crucial role in the formation of aspirations and the strategies that people kind of use to reach those goals. And that's a multitude of both biophysical and social factors. And so aspirations are kind of a function of that physical reality in which people live, such as geography and climate, but also people's ability to explore and exploit that space. And that's mediated by social factors such as social identity, norms, and expectations. And so looking at aspirations can tell us not only about people's desired futures, but also those constraints and barriers that people face in the formation and achieving their aspirations. And in light of this, several of the papers kind of caution against this idea of kind of aspirational gaps and poverty traps, and that immediate needs often restrict people's aspirations and their ability to pursue their goals. So for example, environmental shocks or invasive species, land degradation, these can reduce people's ambition, but also limit the scope of their aspirations. And these kind of aspirational failures tend to be likely more prevalent in poorer and marginalized groups, so raising those concerns about widening gaps. And I think this really kind of brings home that need for development, not just to respond and cater to aspirations, but also the need to kind of increase people's capacity to aspire and even kind of broaden people's aspirational windows, for example, what they perceive as desirable or even possible in their futures. And many of the studies also demonstrate, as we've mentioned, about that kind of diversity of aspirations and challenge some of the underlying assumptions that we might have. So, you know, in agricultural development, it's commonly assumed that people that farm want to farm, or that young people aren't interested in pursuing farming as a livelihood. Yet in our studies, we see that even amongst households that do farm, many of them don't share or mention farming in their aspirational kind of futures. And many young people do aspire to remain locally or pursue mixed both farming and non-farming activities. And so this diversity exists not just between households and at the community level, but also within households themselves, as we've discussed, you know, with men and women within the same household, for instance. Men may want to move out of farming and pursue non-farming activities, while women within the same household might wish to kind of invest in agriculture and even commercialize their production. So you have this diversity across scales. And so understanding that kind of variation across those scales can influence project design, but that we need to kind of have support mechanisms that can cater for those diverse aspirations. And that's going to be quite important. So another clear message is that aspirations aren't static, and so that they shift and change continuously throughout people's lives, but also in response to new knowledge and exposure. And so again, in the studies in Kenya, we see an increase in, I guess, farming related aspirations with increasing age. So while young men might, for example, aspire to invest in businesses in towns and cities now, later in life, they might plan to return to farming during their retirement. And so this dynamic nature of people's desires means that any kind of assessment or understanding that we have of aspirations really needs to be kind of adaptive and responsive. So not just reactive to the goals that we might kind of capture in a single kind of snapshot in time, whether that's you know, through an index or the sense making type surveys. So we have to kind of accept that, yes, people's aspirations are crucial, but they're also not constant, and that they tend to change at any point in time and over time as well. And so through the papers in the special issue, we've seen kind of how that bottom-up view of aspirations can provide that kind of entry point for development initiatives, but also that it's not enough simply to measure and capture and kind of cater to aspirations. And as we've started discussing that there needs to be that negotiation at multiple levels. And also I think those kind of well thought out engagement processes that can build strong relationships and allow for kind of people to voice their visions for the future and incorporate them into project design. And I think, I mean, looking through the names, I know that there's a number of people here that will have some ideas about how this can be done or already is being done, which I really hope that you'll kind of bring to the discussion a bit more. But before that, I think we're going to hand over to Javier, who's going to bring the kind of more top-down vision of aspirations. Great, thank you very much.
Superb, Mary, thank you so much. Javier, please, you have the floor.
Let me. All right, yeah, thank you very much, and a warm welcome also from my side. Yes, as Mary already said, she was focusing and summarizing the papers which are based on more bottom-up aspirations, and I'm now shifting to the left arrow here to the more or less top-down vision for development, which we are covering in a special issue. You see 6 papers here, and the majority of them are results from our CRC, the Collaborative Research Center on Rural Africa, Future Rural Africa, and I'm happy that Detlef is around because he's also our speaker of this really huge project. All right, the second set, as I said, explores top-down political aspirations translated into large-scale development projects and their impacts on livelihoods. Nation states often adopt desirable futures from international organizations and attempt to improve people's livelihoods. So they are coming with good intentions. The papers in this section cover themes around urban migration, which is also a desirable future if you look at publications from the World Bank, wildlife conservation, large-scale irrigation schemes, growth corridors, integration into value chains, road infrastructure, and mega projects like airports or railway investments. So let me just give you a quick overview about on some of the papers. I'm not able to really get into detail, but I hope that you, after my short presentation, you get a taste of it and also get interested in reading this. So contrary to the expectations of the World Bank, for example, urban centers in many African countries are having difficulties to provide employment opportunities to the massive inflow of labor from rural to urban areas. Chamberlain and al, they were analyzing under which conditions outmigration can be mitigated and test quantitatively whether more vibrant rural economies in Zambia have an impact on the exodus of youth from rural areas. And interestingly, they demonstrate that more vibrant rural economies are less prone to outmigration, although the sectoral composition matters. So giving, let's say, development impulses in the rural area, that seems to make sense. This opportunity space is what is often attempted to be changed through large-scale development initiatives, such as large irrigation schemes like SACOT. And Britta Höllermann and her co-authors analyzed how the presence and prospects of irrigation schemes affect aspirations, and introducing and supporting the notion that the biophysical opportunity space here, reliable water supply as a key input into farming, is a critical component of aspiration formation. They outline how external changes in this opportunity space affect local aspirations in decision-making. A similar approach to broadening the opportunity space of rural people is investigating by Kalvelage and myself and others. We focus on how community-based resource management impacts local livelihoods. So community-based natural resource management is designed to combine nature conservation and rural development with conservation areas serving as a resource base for example, wildlife tourism. In parallel, a growth corridor increases the accessibility for tourists, but tourism-driven development reaches only a very limited number of rural residents, although 20% of the turnover is kept in the region. So if you see people employed, then they are often employed in low-wage jobs. On the contrary, tourism business outside Zambezi, for example, in the capital of Windhoek, or travel agents in Europe are able to appropriate value created in the resource region and addressing the importance of also looking at other spatial levels when these initiatives are implemented. Matisek and Werner shed light on the potential downsides of these top-down development approaches through their focus on human-wildlife conflicts. In the Kilombero Valley in Tanzania, they focus on a recent project by the African Wildlife Foundation to restore degraded wildlife corridors. As a consequence, the tensions between local residents' aspirations for future lives collides with restoration efforts promoted by outside actors. This finding emphasizes how closer consideration and alignment of these conflicting goals are critically important as resources are otherwise spent unproductively or even destructively. And finally, the paper by Müller-Mahn, that of Müller-Mahn and his colleague, take the example of mega projects in Kenya. Yeah, as I said, an international airport, they're speaking of 4 mega projects in their paper and outline how the proposed concept of politics of aspiration leads to success or failure of these types of projects in relation to the local benefits they set out to provide. Especially, and they are highlighting this, especially for the case of the Isiolo Abattoir project, they highlight the role of policy or politicians' aspirations, which in some cases can take the form of wishful thinking and potentially lead to failures. However, it's not easy to assess these mega projects. Complex projects like these are difficult to evaluate. And while some promises may not have been kept, others may still materialize. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Javier, for unpacking some of those on the left-hand side of the framework. All right, let's open up the floor. Perhaps if you don't mind, just stop sharing the screen and we'll come back so we can see one another. That's fantastic. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we are looking at these local aspirations and what that means, and we're looking at the more top-down institutional aspirations and what that means. And we're not seeing as many papers forthcoming around where those meet. So one of the questions I wanted to ask the group is, why is it that top-down aspirations don't often match with local visions or aspirations? What's your experience? Or what does your deep wisdom tell you? I am looking for someone to give a response.
Can I begin?
Detlef,
Yeah.
jump in, and then I'm going to invite others. Thank you.
Really, just to jump in. Perhaps not a perfect answer to what you were asking, but a notion coined by Arjun Appadurai is the what he calls the capacity to aspire, something we didn't talk about so far. What he defines as the capacity to aspire is the capacity or the ability to imagine alternative, better futures. And I think it's here where I would see an answer or a partial answer to your question. Poor people often, well, what they can imagine is to have enough to eat, but not much more than that. I would dare to say. Whereas development planners may have a completely different idea of better futures, which does not only include more things to eat, but whatever, roads, dams, you name it. And what we need to understand is what is the reason for the capacity to aspire and limitations of these capacities.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Detlef. I'm going to come to Mika Born and then come back to Javier.
Great, thanks, Constance. And I don't think there is an answer to that question. I think there's just a lot of different views on where the gaps may be. But I feel that one of the big gaps is that there is such a diverse community with diverse aspirations, and there are not many mechanisms to have a negotiation at that level and then link it to these sort of more top-down processes. Often there's a lot of emphasis at the national level. Hopefully there's a lot of emphasis at the community level, and the way that those two meet in terms of institutions, capacity, negotiation mechanisms are often under-supported, and the mechanisms for that to take place, I think, are sometimes lacking. And I'm sure, I can see Ed's hand went up, so I'm sure that Ed has a perspective on that as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mika. Javier, may I go to Edmund first and come back to you?
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Ed, please.
Mika, you anticipate me. My issue with top down, it tends to be driven from the capital city, tends to be driven by technology, tends to be driven by returns, what are the economic returns, not to individual, but to the country to satisfy World Bank credentials and so forth. And local people are basically not involved. They get told what to do because we, the experts, say you should do A, B, and C. And I still see that in 2021. I saw it 30, 40 years ago, and it's still there. We've got to have some sort of coming together of these two worldviews, if you will, and one that will focus more on local and how local benefits local, but how local also benefits national and if necessary, international. And we've got to try and move away because basically it's development arrogance that somebody from the capital city should go out to someone like Turkana County and tell people how to manage livestock. So I think there's room for a change in here. Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant. All right, Javier, please jump in.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, and I would like to be a little bit provocative, why not that much has been learned by, let's say, putting so much money into infrastructure in the 70s and 80s or 60s and 70s, right? We already had a wave of investments in large infrastructure, which especially in countries, not in all the countries, really turned out into success. And I wonder why, let's say, this understanding of development and development mechanisms are still very much, let's say, based on textbooks and where neoclassical approaches are enhanced, where probably connectivity leads to the, let's say, reach of markets. When you reach markets, then you are able to specialize. You could start generating economies of scale, right? Then others will show up. They will also invest. And all this seems to be happening automatically. And I'm wondering why not so much, or let's say, why this is still a construction side. And I like very much this intervention by Detlef, the capacity of us to aspire. Yes, I think capitalizing people is important, but also to understand what they wish and where they want to go.
Brilliant. Thanks for registering another question into the mix. All right. Do we have responses? Do we have follow-ups? I'm going to seek people out if you don't raise your hand. So Kai, I see you smiling. Do you want to say anything, or are you now going to hide?
No, I'm not hiding. I'm just freezing. Change in temperature. There is also another hand raised, so I'm not going to take too much time. I just want to caution that the sort of the limited capacity to aspire, I think it's an easy escape route in many cases where you want to sort of push development intervention through into an area where people have limited choices. But I think the capacity can also be enhanced through a conversation about aspirations within the community and recognizing options that are available to the people there and that can be seen. So it's not necessarily a limitation of working with aspiration if the capacity to aspire or the opportunity windows are fairly narrow, because those can be enhanced once you understand that. And you can still then respond more closely to the needs of the local population.
Thanks for that, Kai. Mikael, you
Yeah,
have the
thank
floor.
you. Thank you. It's more a question, but it relates to what to do with different ways and capacities to aspire to aspiration. Because if we hear that some people just have the aspiration to be food secure, I think that is clearly under aspirational, the very low aspiration. On the other hand, somebody here in the floor talked about wishful thinking. That is maybe the other extreme. It is what is the difference? And that is my question here. What is the difference? And can you judge when a realistic aspiration converts into wishful thinking? Have you thought about that? Because on the other, it is capacity to aspire on the one hand, maybe also knowledge about what is achievable for certain people. I mean, Elon Musk has certainly other aspirations and other possibilities than a smallholder farmer. And he is maybe, so have in your research, that is the question, can you delineate a little bit or the area where aspiration converts into wishful thinking, which is no longer useful or even driving activities, but which is blocking people from doing what they can do? Because I think that would be very, very helpful in education, in schools, in communication between top-down and bottom-up people, if they have a corridor of realistic aspirations.
So appreciate that. Excellent questions. I'm going to go to Sierra first.
Hello, everyone. Just building on this idea of not having the capacity to aspire, or perhaps there is arrogance from projects' perspectives that differ from what rural aspirations might be. Perhaps there's also a lack of incentive from projects to meaningfully engage with the diversity of interests and aspirations and needs in rural contexts. So perhaps the incentive of donor projects is, to meet the desires of citizens of their own country or the business interests of their own country. So I would like to add in or discuss further like a political economy analysis of why projects are designed in certain ways and why they tend to focus on things like scale and not necessarily place-based, context-specific diversity and of aspirations. Thank you.
Great intervention. Thank you so much, Sierra. All right, does anyone want to add to? I think we're accumulating great questions. I wonder, Mary, would you like to take the floor for a moment, given the questions? And perhaps you have a question back to the group.
Sure, I'll give it a go. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that have kind of come up, and I'm just going to probably come back to that idea about, I guess, just touching on that idea about the, viability or, whether people's aspirations are realizable given maybe the constraints. And I guess kind of managing those expectations about what kind of external actors can support with or what we can't. And I guess I'm coming from that from the kind of, you know, agricultural research and development point of view. And I'm just kind of thinking from, you know, some of the work that I was involved in Kenya, where, you know, we have many women saying that they want to invest in farming, become, you know, large-scale farmers and supply markets. But of course, there is that limitation of farm size. Many of these women have extremely small farms. And I think that's sometimes something that's got to be kind of discussed and negotiated, is about that kind of, well, how viable or realistic is that given the current constraints or other options. But also, you know, whether those kind of expressed aspirations are kind of constrained by, you know, social norms that kind of limit them from moving out of rural life, or are they kind of making the best of an opportunity that they find themselves in? And I guess just kind of thinking about, you know, ways that we can kind of address that and manage expectations in terms of, you know, helping people and communities identify, you know, what they can do out of their own autonomy, or what we can assist with, or what can happen at the community level, and kind of, I guess, you know, scanning that opportunity space, so not narrowing that aspirational window. Those are just some of the kind of thoughts that came into my head from those discussions. But yeah, I guess maybe something I'd want to pose was just around, you know, what are the dangers, I guess, of those bottom-up views, if you're losing sight of maybe those larger, broader, you know, rural transformation trends that aren't necessarily visible at the local level.
Okay, thank you for that question. Let me just ask you, danger to who? Or for researchers?
I guess in terms of, you know, that idea of like responding to aspirations, whether they might not lead to the outcomes that people themselves that held those aspirations actually kind of have.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, so I'm going to invite people to think about these questions and be prepared to bring some new ideas. In the meantime, Detlef, let's give you the floor again.
Referring to some of the comments we've had over the past 5 minutes, I think this is one of the elephants in the room, this notion of rationality of aspirations. So do aspirations actually achieve what they aim at or not? And I think this question is incomplete, because it's there is not a linear relationship between the aspiration and the probability that it actually realizes its goals. But here again, I'm referring to Jens Beckert's work about fictional expectations. In a moment when a majority of people follow the same aspirations, there's a higher probability that these aspirations become true. That's what he calls imagined futures. And Beckert in several works argues that imagined futures actually are a key driver of capitalist society. So economic decision makers cannot know the future, but as soon as a majority of decision makers come to an understanding about a certain probability of the future, and they all believe in this imagined future, their decisions aim in the same direction. So they become harmonized, if you like. And I think this is something we need to understand in relation to the aspirations of rural populations in Africa, where we have done our research in Eastern Africa, where we got the impression that when a large group of people have the same hopes and desires and ideas of how a good future would look like, there's a higher probability that this future will actually arrive. So that's in the paper I did together with Eric Kyoko and Kennedy Mkutu. We called the mega projects beacons of hope. So they do deliver something, even though they may not actually materialize as planned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Detlef. All right. Okay, we have heard a lot about East Africa, for example, and I would invite colleagues who are very familiar with East Africa if they want to make some comments. You'll find that I'm incredibly patient. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a lot of questions raised, and there are a lot of high value humans here. What are our thoughts? Are we doing things right? Are there tools in the toolbox that would help respond to these questions? Luke, you look like you may want to respond, because I know you were in one of those bridging papers.
I'm going to have to speak very quietly because my son's asleep very close by, so apologies. I think there's been a lot of interesting questions, and questions and comments have been made. And I mean, one thing that springs to my mind is I've always been quite conscious about the term aspiration failure, because there's often kind of focuses the kind of, in a sense, puts a responsibility for poverty back onto the individual, perhaps the situation back onto the individual by framing it in terms of an individual failing. And so I suppose I'm always quite cautious of that term, and my paper looked at the ways in which aspiration was very much formed within the material, the kind of political and the environmental context as well, and looking at how aspirations were very much formed within that broader context. So I mean, not really to answer the question, but or any comment, but that was really a point that I just wanted to raise, following on from the discussion so far.
Okay, thank you for jumping in, Luke. Apologies to make you speak while someone's sleeping. Listen, folks, let's take the next couple of minutes. What I'd really like to hear is, based on these questions that have been asked, some of the responses, experiences, what does this mean? What does it mean for development? What does it mean for research and development? What do we need to talk to our donors about? What does it mean for movement building? Political mobilization? What needs to change? I know we can learn from the papers, but what are the practical take-homes? Dennis, are you there?
Sorry, Constance, can I go ahead?
Absolutely.
Yes,
Martin, yes, please.
Yeah, I wanted to reflect a little bit in terms of policy, but also in terms of the results we are getting after 3 or 4 years of looking at aspirations from Kenya, Tanzania, and Namibia. And one thing which comes up clear, and it's very true to what Detlef alluded to, and Apadurai, is this very nice concept of the capacity to aspire. And what I really find interesting about Apadurai is how he separates the rich and the poor. So in his words, that the rich have navigated the society, they have the best social networks, and because of that, they can aspire and achieve what they aspire for. But the poor, their kind of brittle social networks make them not to aspire. And even if we're talking about social networks and how aspirations are a social construct, there have been a lot of experiments how to induce aspirations, how to exogenously kind of increase aspirations, because there is the argument that high aspirations would definitely lead to higher welfare. And when this has been done using role models to build aspirations for rural communities, and one key example is a study from Ethiopia, where it's a whole rural region where poverty is very high and education is very low. And then they had this experiment where they used rural role models from the region who had succeeded, who had sent their kids to school, and the kids were successful. And they used this kind of a scenario, and that led to a lot of high aspirations, educational aspirations of parents for their children. But more importantly, you could see that this was really, really poor girls. So you could see more parents wanting to send their children to school and kind of get the highest education. And this is also what we observed in Kenya, Emmanuel and I, when we're looking, when we use vignettes to see how parental aspirations for children along gender-separated kind of basis. And we saw that also in Kenya, religiosity was kind of something which was coming up very strongly to build aspirations. But in terms of policy, this is not coming up that if we really want to build aspirations, we should kind of expose households, we should give them information. And one big way of getting information is through role models. But also, when I'm thinking again about it, and with some results that I have from my studies, is the fact that, going back to Padura, is the fact that households who are poor will not aspire. So I'm not thinking, do we really need to just expose households to role models to build their aspirations, or we need to go back to the strong econometric, the strong economic way of boosting welfare by giving households cash? So I think this is something which is unexplored. This is something which is interesting, looking at how cash and kind of exposing households to social information, and that can build the aspirations. So I think in terms of policy, this is also something we should not discard, that cash transfers, or it's all not good, but I think it sets households to a point where they can then aspire, of course, full impact from a Padura.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Martin. All right, I've registered that last question in the chat box. What do we say to our wide-ranging partners in the work that we're doing? What do we have to say about the research? What do we have to say about movement building, development? What do we say to people who are setting global targets? I think we've heard some of these, don't be so arrogant, etc. And don't mix up your aspirations with other things. But let's please, I know a lot of you have not taken the floor, but I'd love it if you would drop something into the chat box as a response, because if this conversation were mind mapped, we would have tentacles and tentacles and tentacles. But what we haven't done is to be able to bring things into more synthetic messaging, in my view, that we could actually articulate to our partners. But there's a wealth of information in these papers. Emmanuel, I'm going to give you the floor, and then we'll take our last minute to invite our editors to make any closing remarks. Emmanuel, please.
Yeah, maybe to just throw one more spanner into the thing is to think about the triggers of aspiration. I think what's clear, Javier asked a question earlier about what has changed the last 50 years, about how much money has gone into infrastructure, how much money has gone into hardcore kind of, development intervention. And all of a sudden we realize that poverty is not reducing in certain regions, despite all the amount of financial resources going into these areas. And in the last 5 years or so, 10 or 5 years, now we know that sometimes development does not happen just by hard intervention, but by mindset change, or by thinking differently, or by these kinds of things. And despite how trivial it is, that's what we're thinking about with Martin in Kenya, when we thought about, I think things like faith, beliefs, values, things like this, how can they trigger people to think differently? Well, we might not use them as instruments, but I think it might be important for research and development focused work to think about the triggers of aspirations, or the triggers of mindset change in a certain way. I was looking at a report of a cash transfer program in Uganda recently, and a recipient of a cash transfer who was saying, "Hey, look here, they gave me this amount of money, but I can't even do this with this amount of money." And then I thought, okay. What could this person think about this amount of money? Is it empowering him, or is it disempowering him and his agency to think differently? And I think that's where we could focus some research questions to think about that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Emmanuel. All right, we're moving short on time now. So Dave, Kai, Javier, as the editors of this special edition, can I give you 30 seconds to say something brief and brilliant? Dave, please, you have the floor.
Maybe not brief or brilliant. Well, brief, but not brilliant. There's a question mark as people have raised over the feasibility of achieving their aspirations. But what it does do, I feel, is that it at least identifies what people are interested in. This may be the shortcoming of our previous approach in agriculture, in that we just assumed everybody was interested in agriculture. So a better knowledge of aspirations will at least give us some clues as to what proportions of what populations are interested in various sectoral activities, and at least give us the opportunity to refocus our interventions.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was also interested in baskets of options, which somebody raised earlier on. This is an old idea that's been used a long time ago in agriculture. What we probably need, given the more complicated situation these days, is that we need more baskets, or bigger baskets with a more diverse range of options.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Javier, please.
I think the most important message for me is that those aspirations, top down and bottom up, they need to somehow talk to each other, right? So this is very, very important. And also that, let's say, the top down visions do not outcompete good initiatives at the local level, because you have people, you find people, even in the remotest areas, which have good ideas, who aspire to start a horticulture business, for example, and they are somehow hindered by top-down visions and impeding that these ideas, local indigenous ideas, could evolve. And I think this is really very, very important, right, for me. And probably we need a second volume of a special issue, focusing more on let's say, the political implications of aspirations.
Thank you for that, Javier. All right, Kai, you kicked us. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Of course, I would like to thank everyone here participating in the discussion today, and also our contributors, of course, of this in this special issue. It was really great having you here.
Thank you, Javier. All right, Kai, you opened us. Please give us some closing remarks.
Yes, also thanks everyone for the contributions and for the discussions. It was really interesting, and I think it is clear that aspirations are an interesting topic still, and that we haven't solved the puzzle by any means. So we'll continue working on it, and if anybody wants to reach out for the second round of contributions, just let us know. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kai. All right, so it's just mine to say thank you all for taking the time. You've been very generous with the time. We've gone over a bit, and I want to thank everyone. And we're delighted that authors were able to join and listen in and learn more. So please take the opportunity to check on the papers, and I am going to push the editors to at least put out a blog with some of the questions that emerged, if not the answers. So with that, thank you so much. Have a lovely evening, day. It was a pleasure to work with you today. Okay. Please put your screen on if you can, your video. Please say ciao.
Thank you, Constance, for the perfect guidance here. Right? Thank you.
Thank you.
Bruno, great to see you. Lovely to see people's faces. Thank you. Thanks all. Thank you, Alexander.